Well, as our topic indicates tonight, I want to talk about the Peace of Paris. You might know it as the Treaty of Versailles. But really, Versailles plays very little into this. All the negotiations that happened after World War I were in the city of Paris. 5 different treaties were consummated at that time to solve the issue of World War I. So we're going to talk tonight about this treaty because this treaty unfortunately still haunts us today. So we're going to give everybody an opportunity to get in here. Everybody in there? Okay. So I want to thank the museum. Obviously, this is like coming back home. It started many years ago for us, 2013. We used to bring 200 people plus a night in for a World War II lecture series. And that kind of put not only the museum on the map, it also cemented our legacy as well. So this place has always had a fond place for me. We talked about the Center for Experiential Learning, making history and the other social sciences jump out. We can study things, we can talk about things, but there's nothing more powerful than seeing things, experiencing things, getting to know things. And that's what the focus of the Center for Experiential Learning is. We do trips, lectures, movies, performances. We do a number of different things to engage you, the learner. And it doesn't matter if you're 16 or 17 or 96. You are always welcome to be amongst us. And I think that's important. The multi-generational experiences not only make our students better, which we have some college students with us tonight, but it also sharpens you up. And that's one of the things I always used to like about our trips, because we used to always quip that the older people that got on the bus, they might have felt like they were 75, 80, but by the time they got off the bus, they were moving like 18, and then the 18-year-olds were moving like 80. I don't know what the heck happened, but it just used to happen. Now, if you're really interested in something interesting, we're going to be presenting Thursday night. The history guys, Kurt Troutman and myself, will be at the Tri-Cities Museum. We're going to be talking on a topic called Michigan Fencibles. I don't know why we called it Fencibles, but it's the Toledo War and the Battle of Fudge Island. Now, you don't know either of those, do you? Well, that's why you got to come. It's at the Tri-Cities Museum, 6:30 p.m. Tri-Cities Museum is in Grand Haven, 200 Washington Street. Come on out, hear about it. We talked about the 6 performance. No need to belabor that. I will have a contact number where you can call me up or email me. We'll get you going on it if you'd like. All right, so tonight's presentation, we're going to look at this Peace of Paris. We're going to do some analysis. How did 3 world leaders mess up the world? Because they did. That's my opinion. You might say, well, they fixed the world. I'm going to argue vehemently they didn't. I'm going to tell you that assumptions, idealism doesn't always meet reality. And reality trumps all of those. And their failure to understand basic things like nationalism and self-determination created the hodgepodge mess that we have for foreign affairs today. So we're going to show you how simple lines, simple borders, do not equate to permanent solutions. And we're fighting a lot of that today. This is 1914. This is Europe. Notice some things here. The size of Austria-Hungary. Look at how large Austria-Hungary was. Formidable empire. I want you to think of it as 57 different types of people, like 57 ingredients. You ever see that on the Heinz label? 57 varieties. Think of Austria-Hungary as 57 varieties of people, okay? We're going to look at this big monolith over here called the Ottoman Empire, which not only encompassed part of the Balkans, but also swung around and included the Saudi Arabian Peninsula and part of North Africa, and how that is going to meet its demise after World War I. We're going to be looking at how France, Russia, and Britain are fighting a Central Powers basis of Germany, Austria, and initially Italy was part of this, but Italy never goes in with Germany and Austria to fight. It'll be eventually the Ottomans and Bulgaria that will join up with Germany to do the fighting. And this is Europe in 1920. And you're going to notice what happened to Austria. Whoop. No pointer here? Look at it. What happened to it? Well, it gets shredded into a number of different countries. And the Ottoman Empire has been reduced to one country called Turkey. So what developed out of all of this mess? Well, before we get into that, we need a little primer on World War I, right? You all have heard about World War I. You might have some knowledge. You might be a little rusty. So I'm going to give you World War I in 7 minutes. Okay? Is everybody cool with that? If you want more, I can give you more, but that'll be a private lecture, different time, different place, over a cup of coffee or something, all right? So World War I goes from 1914 to 1918. And what is important to understand about World War I, it is a transitional military experience. We are going from the old style of fighting, mass armies on fields, out in the rural area, mixing it up, to now more mechanized, modernized weapons, and armies are going to be slow to adjust. But when they start to adjust, they are going to introduce what we would call today weapons of mass destruction beyond belief. But one of the things you have to understand, wars have a starting place, don't they? I'm going to blame it on these three cats. These three gentlemen are cousins. What we have here is, this is King George of England. This is our friend, Tsar Nicholas. And this is Kaiser Wilhelm. All of these guys are first cousins. They have one common grandmother, Queen Victoria of England. When you're a royal, you have a very finite pool to date from. I'm sorry, Walt Disney. They don't go out and find Cinderella or Snow White. They don't go out and marry commoners. They marry other nobles from other countries who oftentimes are only a few generations or a few ticks down the family tree from themselves. Second cousins, maybe even a first cousin once in a while. Okay? Now, these guys don't get along so well. Two of them get along pretty good. The third doesn't get along with anybody. And maybe it isn't his fault. Kaiser Wilhelm had a birth defect, a shriveled left arm. Now you can imagine in the early 1900s a birth defect. How devastating that must have been to him. How he must have been treated by his peers. We know that kids with challenges are treated very differently today, aren't they? They're often treated poorly. So these guys are competitors. And to compensate for his physical disadvantages, Kaiser Wilhelm is over the top. He has to do everything better, bigger, bolder than his cousins. I want you to keep that in perspective. So we're going to have, before World War I, alliances. There's concerns. Germany has come together rather rapidly. There is no Germany on the map in 1850. There's a country called Prussia. And in 20 years' time, it is going to get 3 times larger, and it's going to transform itself into a country that we call today Germany. And part of this is a product of what we will talk about in terms of nationalism, okay? Armies are not used for beautiful parades. Got that? We don't raise up militaries to have them dance. That's why I always laugh at, like, the North Korean army. We call them dancing armies. You know, they always look at their weapons. Are they formidable, or are they just there for show? Most militaries are there not for show, but to be formidable, to either threaten people or to actually fight. Germany is a threat. It has won 3 wars in a 10-year period. It beat up on Denmark, it beat up on Austria, and finally they took over and beat up their formidable neighbors, the French, who supposedly had a better army. In fact, they did such a good job that they were in Paris in less than 3 months, and they had captured the French leader Napoleon III in the process. So people fear Germany. So the response is this triple entente consisting of England, France, Russia, and later there'll be a number of other countries that will join their effort. And here's the lineup, the Triple Alliance, which mainly is Germany and Austria, to a lesser extent the Ottoman Empire. Now, why do I have Italy start? Initially, Italy was on their side. The war breaks out, Italy stays neutral and decides to jump over to the Triple Entente. Found it better over there. Now, what was the precipitating point? The assassination of the Austrian Archduke, right? Ferdinand, and his wife, Sophie Chotnik. Why isn't she the Archduchess or something? Does anybody know why? She had lost her title. Her family had fallen in hard times. They had sold off all their possessions. And Archduke Ferdinand was not the natural person in line to take the throne. He had come up as a second choice because his cousin, Franz Joseph's son, had done a devious thing. He cheated on his wife, fell in love with a ballerina, attempted to marry the ballerina. She said, "I don't want anything to do with you because you're already married." And he, in a fit of rage, murdered the ballerina and killed himself. Could you imagine such an embarrassment to any sort of crown ruler? Franz Joseph was upset. So the next in line male is a nephew who is not exactly the most robust symbol of power. Franz, Ferdinand is just a kind of a common guy. Well, what is he doing in Sarajevo? Well, the Austrians had just annexed this country. They're celebrating their 5th anniversary of annexation. They invited him because he's the next guy in line. They want to put on a big parade. They have a big ball planned. They send a nice invitation and they address it to the Archduke and Archduchess. And it just happened to fall on their wedding anniversary. What scary things, huh? Out comes popping this young man, an 18-year-old Serbian nationalist, part of a group called the Black Hand, shoots and kills both of them. And this precipitates a war. But it doesn't start right away. Could you imagine Kamala Harris going to a foreign country, being assassinated by some terrorist organization? How long do you think that we would allow that to go unchecked there, without account? Probably a day, maybe 2. Well, guess what? 6 weeks went by. before Austria took advantage of this, because they had to confer with their bigger brother, Germany. And there was this sweeping plan. In case of war, the Germans have to fight a two-front war. They have to fight against France on one side and Russia on the other. Who is going to be faster to mobilize? Everybody knows it's going to be the French. So the Germans have the von Schlieffen plan, this wide sweeping plan to try to achieve capture of Paris. They want to do it within 4 weeks. Now, you military guys in the crowd, you see a lot of hats. I thank you for your service, gentlemen. But when commanders tell you a timetable to fight, how often does that come true? Not always, right? Pretty hard to do, isn't it? The Germans nearly pull it off. Except that at a critical point, and we'll come back to this in a second, they mobilize and stop the German advance. Yes, folks, those are taxi cabs. The French had to call up their reserves and bring them to the front lines to the Battle of Marne using taxi cabs. They didn't have enough trains to get the troops to the tracks, to the battlefield. Now, could you imagine? War has been declared. Whoop, can I go backwards? Yeah, there I can go backwards. People could not clamor fast enough to volunteer. Everybody thought this war would be over in 2 months. Every young guy was looking for glory. They were signing up like it was going out of style. Recruiting lines were miles long. This is British gentlemen signing up. They can't get in quick enough. They think this war, which starts August 6th, is going to be done before Christmas. So they want in. This is, your manhood is on the line. Did you serve or didn't you? We can't wait. Well, folks, Battle of Marne. The turning point, because this starts the quagmire. The French hold. Paris does not get overrun. Now Germany has to shift its efforts from its western front to the east to take on the Russians. And the war begins to get worse. It's the Battle of Gallipoli, because now the war is extending. It's the battle outside of Constantinople, Bosporus Straits, British, Australian, New Zealand troops. Yes, folks, this was so poorly executed that a future hero is going to lose his position, Winston Churchill, because the Brits suffer such great losses. And then in 1916, Battle of Verdun. French and English take on the Germans. The idea here is to make the French bleed white. Well, I don't know who bled white more, because when you see those figures, 330 or 328,000 casualties by the Germans and 348,000 French casualties in a battle that lasted about 2 months. Could you imagine the youth going across the fields, making no gains, being killed by the hundreds, by the thousands on a daily basis? The life shattered, and they're living in the mud in these trenches, and yes, folks, those are dead. Could you imagine the horror that these young people were facing? Later that year, 1916, Battle of Somme. Yes, folks, that's 1.5 million shell casings you're looking at. The British, the first day, laid down such a heavy barrage on the Germans that they thought they had broken the German army. Little did they know when they crossed the field, the Germans they were unscathed. There was 1 million casualties. 1 million casualties. Could you imagine? 1 million young people dead, wounded, one battle. You know how much distance they covered? In 6-month periods, 6 miles. So you could imagine what it must have been like. These are true to God pictures of men living in the trenches. I can imagine moles or badgers or other animals that burrow. You're living, this is your 24/7 living accommodations, folks. It rains. And that trench is full of mud and water. And it stunk. And you were dirty. And you were cold. And you can't light a fire. So why are these people fighting? What's going on? This is year now 1917. The Russians who went into this war underprepared, the largest army, their troops have lost their will to fight. The call is for land, peace. And guess what? The Tsar has to go to the front line, Tsar Nicholas himself. Now, I would just picture this for a moment. Just take your favorite president, Joe Biden, Donald Trump. You put him in a military uniform, you send him to the front line. And he's going to take control? What the hell do they know? That's how much he knew. He never served. He didn't have any of this. So he's trying to lead them. Obviously, the Germans had a better scenario. They imported revolutionaries, a guy named Vladimir Lenin and another one named Leon Trotsky, and suddenly the Russians begin to mutiny and they don't want to fight. And the Russian forces start to splinter. They start fighting themselves. Eventually Russia has to back out of the war. They strike up a peace with the Germans. Now the Germans have to, here's the Russians celebrating the fact they don't have to fight anymore. They're dancing. Imagine. Hey, we don't have to be in that mess anymore. But this isn't great for the Germans nor the Austrians. By 1916, the Austrians, under Emperor Karl, because Franz Joseph had died, he was in his 80s, they started sending out peace feelers. They wanted the war to stop. You know who didn't want it to stop? Their enemies, the Italians, who wanted territory. So nobody wants the other guy to throw the towel in, because that means if they haven't got what they want yet, that's going to be a problem. But this is a problem for everybody. Now, we know how we got in the war, right? You've all heard of the Lusitania. But the thing that really broke our back was the secret telegram that we were told about. We didn't see it. We were told about it. Who told us? Britain. The British told us that the Mexicans were going to attack us with the urging of Germany. Well, this was an outrage, and President Wilson declared war on Germany. And we entered in 1917. We took an army that was the 26th biggest army in the world. We were behind Honduras and Guatemala in terms of troops. And we whipped it into one of the most formidable armies in less than a year. And our boys were over there, as we kind of heard, trying to lead the charge back. Germany in 1918 throws everything it has at the Allied Entente forces. and they can't break through. And we start counterattacking. One thing we ought to also note is that the Kaiser, somewhere about September of 1918, decides to bug out of Germany. He moves over to Netherlands, which was a neutral country, and he left the German High Command, von Hindenburg and von Moltke, in charge. He took off. Could you imagine your leader just takes off mid-war? Goodbye. Have a nice time. I'm done. You guys figure it out. Well, November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day, right? Call it Veterans Day now. Commemorates the fact that the Germans essentially threw the towel in. At no point, just want to emphasize to you, was Germany invaded. The Allies were far from entering German soil. They had physically worn themselves out. So they quit. So now the victors are going to decide the peace terms. And who is representing who? Well, I want you to focus on these top three names because they're going to come up repeatedly tonight. Woodrow Wilson, the US president, David Lloyd George, who is going to be the Prime Minister of England, George Clemenceau, who is the French president, and he's the French president. He came into power in 1917 when the French nearly quit the war. It had gotten so bad at places like Somme and Verdun, the French troops refused to advance. And as you could suspect that there were two lines of trenches oftentimes, the front line was told to advance. The second line was told, if your guys don't advance, you shoot them in the back. Now, you can imagine your son comes home dead with a bullet wound in the back. What's the natural feeling? Coward, eh? Son was a coward. Well, maybe he was smart enough he wasn't going to go get killed for nothing. And then the last person is this Vittorio Orlando, who is the Prime Minister of Italy. But we're going to really focus the most of our intent on the top three. Now, there were 32 nations that were supposedly on the winning side. These included things like, places like Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, Portugal, Brazil, who had sent a company of medical officers to the fight. All of them weighed in at the peace conference. But what's most important, there was no losing side present. So this is truly the victors putting their imprint on the people. Now this process will start almost immediately. Remember November? By January of 1919, the big three are in Paris negotiating, starting the process. All of the talks happen in Paris. Versailles is a sideshow. That's the signing of the final document. But you always know at Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles, you say, well, that solved everything with World War I. No, it only solved things with the Germans. There were 4 other peace treaties that were also involved. Now, part of the peace process involved the development of commissions. We're going to talk about the League of Nations shortly when we talk about Wilson and his 14 points. But these commissions were to how to develop a League of Nations, a peacekeeping group, how to assess who was responsible for the war, how much should they pay, reparations, damages, what should happen to these navies and militaries so we can stop this from ever happening again, because this was an outrage, you know. 8.5 million people died on the battlefield. Essentially, a generation of young people is wiped out in Europe. It's a terrible thing. So when this conference opens up, you can kind of sense that they're all over the place. What is the clear agenda? How fast can this happen? And this was a problem because this process took 6 months to begin to unfold. And a lot of times, there was no central focus. Groups squabbled, countries fought against each other at the peace table, making demands, and throughout this process, you got a sense of how bad it was. This was a statement from one of the diplomats. No matter how hard you try, you cannot imagine the shambles, chaos, the incoherence, and the ignorance here. Does this sound like this is going to get a lot done quickly? No, not really. So, let's profile these leaders real quickly. Woodrow Wilson, I call him the idealist. You know him from your U.S. history books, the guy with the 14 points, right? He was going to solve Europe's problems. Well, he's an American. How does he have any sense of solving Europe's problems? But he's made pronouncements, he's made speeches. He's an academic by training. Professor, later a professor, a president of Princeton University, entered into politics, was a governor of New Jersey, and then became what I would say the accidental president. Because when the Republicans began to squabble amongst themselves, Roosevelt and Taft, they split the Republican vote, and Wilson won in 1912 and was reelected in 1916. So when he proposes in a speech in January of 1918 that there's going to be 14 points for a framework for a future peace, Europeans become excited because he's the only guy that has any sort of vision. Even the American people are kind of excited. Hey, our guy's got a plan. The trouble is, you may have a plan, but who's buying your plan? Very few people are buying in. And this is the problem. Now, he did this in a very judicious way. He just didn't dream these up himself. He called a conference like a good, academic. He brought in 150 people, political scientists, social scientists. Let's discuss the issue. Let's boil these points down. Big conference. They had an exit report, which he drew on his 14 points. And here's some of his points. Open diplomacy. Can't have those, alliances. Freedom of the seas. We can't have people torpedoing neutral ships. We got to remove all these economic barriers. We got to reduce the amount of weapons. We got to fix all these colonies. And so on and so forth. And you can read these things here. But the thing that he is most enamored with is this idea of number 14, an Association of Nations, League of Nations. That's going to be the solution. Let's talk. We can talk this out. We don't need to fight. Well, guess what, folks? Noble to talk, hard to do. Well, his closest political advisor, and one of the persons that is very instrumental in these talks, is this aide, Colonel Edward House. Now, he's not a colonel in the military sense. He's like Colonel Sanders. You know Colonel Sanders? A Kentucky-type colonel? This guy was a politician through and through. He was a Texas machine politician. Great for turning out the vote in Texas. In fact, you got 4 different Democratic governors elected to Texas. So he's really kind of a powerful political figure. And Wilson has kind of made him his confidant. But as time goes on, these two guys will start to drift apart because House is a realist, Wilson is an idealist. Idealists don't want to hear reality. They only want to hear it in the theoretical. Now, here's a guy for you. David Lloyd George. All 5'6", a pragmatic, measured politician, as he called it. Likes the art of compromise. He is the first Labour Prime Minister of England. So he's learned to make deals. He's learned to keep power. And he also realizes that even though England is considered to be the top nation in terms of its power base, it is also in a poor economic situation. They are looking over their shoulder. The U.S. is coming. It's kind of like we look over our shoulder and we see who? China. His goals are going to be different. How do I preserve what we have? How do I try to balance the realities to best suit England? One of the things he's going to spend a lot of time focused on is protection of his colonial system and also trying to pick up German territories or colonies in Africa and making them English colonies. He's going to often find himself trying to reason between the idealist and a person hell-bent on getting revenge. Look at that next statement. I didn't do so bad, considering I was sitting between Jesus and Napoleon. That's how he felt at this peace conference, that he had to sit between two characters that had this larger-than-life persona. And here is the man he's often trying to assuage, George Clemenceau, who comes in like a tiger. He has come into the French leadership position at France's lowest moment. When they're threatening to shoot their own guys in the back, he is elected. And he's got to make the French people believe they can win, and he's going to find a way to cripple Germany, because he realizes that France has been now attacked twice by Germany. First time they were successful, the second time they were within a whisker of being successful again. So he's got to mollify his people so they don't get attacked again. He's got to do something to cripple the German military, because Germany has become the formidable military, not only in terms of its armies, but it also has developed a huge navy during World War I. So he's going to be interested in not only dismantling Germany's military, but also seeking to cripple their economic assets. Without money, you can't build a military. So how do we break the Germans? Take their cash, make their military small, if not ineffective. And how do you make the French people believe that they can be winners? Well, force them to think that you're going to make the other guy pay. And pay deeply for their position. Here's our friend Vittorio Orlando. He also came into play in 1917, leads Italy into the war with a vengeance. Italy did most of its fighting against Austria, and they fought in the Alps. Very hard place to fight. Mountainous, tough terrain. They lost 700,000 troops in a short period of time, with very little gain. During his period of leadership, he had to cure a lot of logistical problems with the French military. He had to get them weapons, he had to get them food, otherwise they would have been in the same sort of situation as the Russians. So he had a lot of different things to deal with. But he feels that he's owed a great debt, that he should be getting a lot of different things for his time. So, Last person we want to introduce, not really part of the big 3 or 4, but setting the problem for the future. This is Sonoji Kinomochi. He is a former Prime Minister of Japan. He is leading Japan's effort at the Treaty of Versailles. Now, you're going to say, well, what role did Japan play in World War I? Well, they fought against the Germans, taking over German possessions in the Pacific, as well as going after the mandated trade colonies that it had in China. Now, what is Japan interested in? Not so much land, but racial equality. Japan has not been treated in their lives as an equal among the Europeans, even though they have fought against the Russians, defeated them in 1905. They're not even accepted in the United States. We had exclusionary policies that kept Japanese as well as Chinese out of the US. Did you know that? By the 1900s, we don't treat yellow people very well. He wants equality. Treat us like you treat yourselves. Well, he's not going to get it. And he's going to go away rebuffed. But he will get, as part of the settlement, some of Germany's islands in the Pacific. So, 5 treaties come out of this. Treaty of Versailles, the one that the history books focus on, because that's how we dealt with Germany. But these 4 other treaties are going to be very significant. The Treaty of Saint-Germain, the Treaty of Neuilly, the Treaty of Cervez, and there's going to be a second treaty later on, which is the Treaty of Lausanne, which is going to deal with the Ottoman Empire after it falls, because it's going to fall in 1920. It's going to become so destabilized that there's a coup d'etat, and what the young Turkish officers took over, called the Young Turks, and they formed a secular country called Turkey to take up on this. And then the Treaty of Trianon. Now, what we need to understand, there are some principles that have to be adhered to. One is sovereignty. People that are seeking the right to represent and have their own countries. A number of these will be in former empires like Austria, etc. We're going to also be looking at concepts of liberty. Well, who's pushing the liberty? Us, US, right? Democracy. Well, that's pretty acceptable for most Western Europeans. But if you lived under a Kaiser or a Tsar, a king, who's been an autocrat, maybe that's not so good. And this idea of self-determination. Making decisions for yourselves to benefit yourselves. These are all pretty high, lofty things. They're going to mean different things to the victors. So the first thing that most people are concerned about is territory. How do we split things up? How do we take things from the losers and give them to the winners? It's kind of like when you sat at that kitchen table with your brothers and sisters and your mother had the apple pie and she tried to cut equal slices. How many times did that result in turmoil? Because somebody always felt they got a smaller piece than somebody else, right? That's how this process was. So the big focus here is breaking up Austria and breaking up the Ottoman Empire. And this is going to create big problems for the future. Now, Britain obviously wanted to be compensated. They wanted rewards. The British had lost an entire army by 1915. Most of the fighting after 1915, they're relying on colonial forces. Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians to carry the weight of the fighting. All those enthusiastic guys signing up in that one photo probably were dead by 1916, or maybe. That's how bad it was. Now, the issue is these dominions, as they were called, they want things. The Australians had lost nearly 70,000 people in World War I. They want territory. What do they want? They want New Guinea. New Zealand wanted Samoa. And South Africa wanted Southwest Africa, which was a colony that the Germans had. So there was a system made up where there were a rating classification. There were Class A mandates, Class B mandates, and there was other mandates to give to Japan. So A, B, and C. The A mandates were going to be given to England and France directly. They were going to make the choices. The B mandates were given to any country that was on the Allied side that had previous colonial experience. So enter in Belgium, Italy, Portugal, which got little pieces of Africa. And then the final grouping was German possessions in the Pacific, which a lot of people didn't want anyway. And the ones that were cast off were given to the Japanese. Now, what this did, it empowered the British dominions. Before World War I, Canada was considered like a lesser country. It wasn't even considered to be a country. It was like a shadow of England. Australia was a shadow of England. But now with World War I, they get a voice, they get demands, and they emerge as independent-like nations. So keep that kind of in the focus. It'll also empower places like India, who suddenly will think, well, why are we sitting around as a colony of Britain? Maybe we ought to be independent as well. So here's some of the areas that began to move, and you can see. Southwest Africa. This we will talk about in a second, the Middle East, because this becomes a real big flashpoint. And the breakup of Austria, which is going to be engineered by the three powers, which is going to be even more interesting. So, what constituted ways to make a country? Well, I want to introduce you to this concept called nationalism. You've heard of this before, but maybe you didn't understand it. Nationalism involves four components. In order to be a nation, you probably have to unite on one or more of these things. So, common language. Do we all speak the same language? Very important. Do we have a shared culture? In other words, do we have certain customs, certain things that we all do together, that we identify with? Do we have a common religion? Are we Catholics? Are we Protestants? Are we Muslims? What are we? Sunni, Shia? What are we? And then what was our former history like? Do we have a time in the past where we were all together? Those determine a nation state. So why do we bring this up? Because one of the first places that they started to do some sort of engineering, which is a total failure, was the Balkans. The Balkans are that peninsula above Greece, places like Serbia, Albania, Montenegro, Romania. They started to divide this up. They did not have a very good concept of the people of that region. They also, the British had to fulfill a promise. They had promised during World War I the Saudis, what would be the Saudi Arabians in the future, that they would give them a country. Now, this was a bunch of nomadic Bedouin herdsmen, 80,000 people, covering a huge area. But they promised them a country for their support fighting the Ottomans. And then there's this issue about what to do about the Jews. Where do they go? What do they do? So somebody said, let's send them back to their ancestral lands. Well, those ancestral lands, some of them didn't even know where they were. They had been gone many, many generations. And now they're wheeling into a place occupied by Palestinians, and they're saying, well, you need to give us some place to go. Now, who is this guy? This is the Greek Prime Minister. His name is Eleftherios Venizelos. He was perhaps one of the most skillful guys at the Paris peace talks, because he had a plan and he knew how to pull at heartstrings. His plan was called the Megali Idea, the big idea. What he was trying to do was take from the Ottomans territory and try to make a version of the Byzantine Empire. Could you imagine that? Well, what would that include? It would include what was Istanbul and part of Asia Minor. And he almost pulls it off, because the Ottomans come out of World War I disorganized, and he keeps pushing with his troops to take more territory. For him, the war isn't really over. So what was contested and gotten the Greeks got was this area of Macedonia, Western Thrace, and initially all of this area called Eastern Thrace, and this area here called Smyrna. Wow. Part of what is modern-day Turkey was in the hands of the Greeks. Well, that's not going to resonate too well with the Turks. Even though there's 1.5 million Greek speakers in Turkey at this time, many of them concentrated in this area called Smyrna, this is not going to sit well. And the war will continue, and continue with a new face involved, a man named Kemal Mehmet, or what we would be also known by the name of Ataturk, the founder of the modern Turkish Republic, who revolted against the sultans, took over, and is going to go to war to try to retain Eastern Thrace and eventually Smyrna. This is going to result in the largest resettlement in history. 1.5 million Greeks will be forced out of Asia Minor, and 500,000 Turks will be forced out of Greece to return back to Turkey in 1924 as part of this Treaty of Lausanne. Instead of stabilizing indigenous ethnic minorities, all this did was create hostilities. So why do we have a Greek-Turkish problem that still festers many years later? Here it is. Then there's this area called Yugoslavia, right? We unite an area of the Balkans because they speak the same language. They don't have the same religion. They don't have a shared culture. They have very few of the elements of nationalism that will bind them together. But because the Serbs are the ones that everybody felt got picked on by the Austrians because of that unfortunate incident, guess what? They are given territory and unite under one country that we will call Yugoslavia. Now look at all these ethnic differences. You got Slovenes, you got Croats, you have Bosnians, you have Montenegrins, and you have parts of what we would consider Macedonians, all combined into one country. Can you imagine that? One country, all these people. Well, it works when you have strong leaders. It doesn't work when you don't. So, this is a potential powder keg. Is it still solved today? No. Just because we draw lines and we say that everybody should get along, does that mean everybody gets along? This is imposed by outsiders saying this is the way it should be, folks. And the loudest voice within here gets to rule. Not a good thing, is it? Then we have these mandates in the Middle East. France and England are going to set up the Middle East. Could you imagine the French and the English setting up anything normal? No, because the French are going to set up Syria. What's going on in Syria today? Huge civil war, right? Groups fighting amongst each other. We're going to have the British who are going to try to set up Palestine under an agreement, trying to get the Palestinians and a Jewish homeland together. Caving into this idea of a Jewish homeland. And then, let's just give the Arabs what they want. You know, that's the desert down there anyway. Let's draw a line. We'll give them a kingdom. The Arabs weren't initially happy with this arrangement. They revolted during the peace talks. And they had to placate them with this agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So here's what they drew up. Here's Syria. Here's Palestine. Here's Iraq. You wonder how Iraq came to be? The British said it should be. Well, you know, up here is a whole group of people called the Kurds. They're going to be divided under 3 different groups. We still have problems today. We're going to have Sunni and Shia within lines here. And then we have this great mandate over here, an independent kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Folks, whenever you see straight lines for borders, unless they're following a natural thing like a river or something, they're a draftsman's dream. That means a cartographer sat down with some politician and they started drawing lines. Just because you draw a border doesn't mean people feel comfortable, do they? Who falls in the border? Who falls outside the border? And how do they react if they're on the wrong side of the line? The Middle East is a mess because of these lines today. These lines were not drawn respecting people inside of them. They were drawn to appease the big powers. And then, of course, the division of Austria into a country that included 2 groups, the Czechs and the Slovaks. You might as well put oil and water together, because that's what it was, because it also included around the periphery a heavy grouping of Germans that were carved out of Germany. And then here's the most controversial thing. We're going to give Poland a window to the sea. And because we're going to have some tensions, there's a city up here called Danzig, also known as Gdansk. We'll make that an independent city for 5 years, and the people of Gdansk can figure out where they want to do. Well, eventually they became Polish. But this is going to create a problem because this is Germany, and now you got this mess in between called Poland. You see what the problem is. How is this going to work? How is this going to make it go on? And then, of course, who's not at the peace table at all? Not even considered. The Russians, the Soviet Union, because they're going through a big civil war. Everybody hates communism. They're scared of it. So, but that doesn't stop anybody. The Baltic states, what do we do with Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia? Well, let's just make them independent countries. They also didn't care. Just make everybody suffer. If you aren't on the right team, you got to give something up. Austria gave something up. So did Hungary. And when you can't fix things that happened in the past, well, just give it a country. 1915, the Ottomans exterminated 1.5 million Armenians. So let's make it right. Let's give Armenia a country. How do you think the Ottomans will feel? We don't care. They lost anyway. And the Armenian issue was kind of tied with this idea of, the Greeks getting their old Byzantine Empire back. It's okay. Some precedent for this. And it didn't matter that the Sultan was in a weak position anyway, so he gave the Armenians their own country. Here it is. Take it part of Turkey. Anybody recognize this guy? Lawrence of Arabia. He's the guy that got the Saudis their empire, their little kingdom. He's the guy that negotiated and made promises. And he forced the British to honor those promises after the war through his actions. But it didn't solve the problem with the Middle East. We talked about Iraq. Why was Iraq so important to the British? Oil. And a British company was drilling for it already before the war. So we better protect our British interests, and we're going to have a company, and we're going to give it concessions. It can keep drilling for 75 more years, etc. Well, at some point, they even thought maybe they ought to make Iraq part of India. Could you imagine that? What a crazy idea. And then Japan. At one point, the Chinese at the table said, well, Korea should be independent. Give them their independence. Well, who had already taken Korea? Japan. 1910. They had made this one of their colonies. Of course, the Chinese were told to get out of town. Leave. This is crazy. What's going to eventually happen here? We're going to have a war? We're going to have other issues? Did this peace conference have any foresight? Could it do the right thing? Apparently not. Yeah, there he is, Ho Chi Minh himself. A little busboy who formerly was in New York at a restaurant. He later went to Paris. He's from Vietnam. He's very interested in Vietnamese independence. He petitioned one of the commissions to try to get the French to relinquish Vietnam. He used language from such esteemed American leaders as Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, etc. in his petition. When they ignored his petition, Where did he find his solace? The socialists of Paris. Ho Chi Minh. Could have been our buddy, but instead we make a what? Enemy. And then, of course, the old war clause. Who's responsible? Who did this? Why should they pay? Germany. Article 231. Assessed the guilt entirely on the Germans. And the Germans were forced to pay the reparations, even though there were 4 other countries that were involved. The heaviest burden fell on the Germans. Now the Bulgarians, they paid it off in cattle. I can only imagine how many cattle they had. It wasn't like Texas was depleted or something. But Germany would have to pay through the nose it did. The French initially wanted 225 billion gold marks, not paper, gold. Could you imagine 225 billion of anything in 1920? This would be equivalent today of like almost $1 trillion. There's no way that Germany could have ever afforded it. Later it was revised down to 132 billion, and they put this debt into categories, A, B, and C. A was the direct payments Germany would have to come up with. B and C would be predicated on its ability to get their economy going. You all recognize this place, right? This is Versailles. This is where the peace treaty was consummated, where the signatures came into play in June of 1920. Here are the people signing off, big fanfare. But we know the realities, right? Let me share with you that the French would be occupying part of Germany. Their best parts of their industrial areas, the Rhineland and the Saar, would be exploited for these reparation payments. The French would regain, of course, Alsace and Lorraine, which they had lost in the War of 1870. And you think inflation is bad today? This is hyperinflation. My students laughed the other day. I told them I was a billionaire. They all were skeptical until I brought out a Zimbabwe $1 billion note, and guess what? I am a billionaire. Too bad that note doesn't even buy me a crumb of bread, but I am a billionaire. Notice, this money is so worthless. Stacked up, it takes 4.5 billion marks to buy a loaf of bread at the height. Look at this hyperinflation. You can't see because unfortunately the controls are here, but this big spike happens in a 4-month period. An inflation rate of 5,000%. Who suffers? Elderly, fixed pensioners. You can't make enough money if you're a blue-collar guy. The German people engaged in an activity of passive resistance. They didn't want to pay the French, therefore they went on strike. And that made their money crash. The only thing that saved this from going right off the charts completely was the U.S. stepped in and offered them loans so they could pay off their French counterparts. And we were sitting on the other side of those loans with our hands back out, collecting from the French as we were trading and selling. And that worked all the way to the Great Depression. So what lessons do we learn, folks, today? Be noble about your ideas of peace. But guess what? Be realistic. Realism requires us to be honorable. not revengeful. The other thing we have to understand is we have to be flexible. What is peace supposed to look like? Is it supposed to be irritating to everybody? Or should it make people feel better after the day is done? The Treaty of Versailles didn't make anybody feel very good. It may have solved the war, but it really created another war, and is still creating conflicts today, because we cannot undo the problems created 100+ years ago. So this is our legacy that hounds us today. You've been a great audience tonight. You want to get a hold of me, there's my email address, or give me a call. I'm always happy to talk. So thank you for coming.